Often it's because people do care, but they just don't get in touch with their MPs, and then so it's not reflected in national policy and law, and things don't change for the better, and then we get upset and cynical. So the main thing in which you can do is go and visit the Climate and Nature Bill website, which will tell you who your constituency MP is, if you don't already know them, and send an email with your support for the bill. And even if you've done that previously, sending another email saying, I would like to know the status of this, is really important too, so keep up the pressure.
In this emergency ClimateGenn episode, I am speaking with Professor Paul Behrens from Oxford Martin School in Oxford about how the Climate and Nature Bill is not just good for the UK, but is actually critical for protecting our own individual and collective interests. Aside from helping us to protect our biodiversity across the nation, if the bill becomes law, it would expand democracy in the UK by creating a Climate and Nature Assembly. At a time when fear is being used as currency to quell any sort of positive action, contacting your MP in support of the bill is one way to demonstrate that you care and are being counted. Thank you to all listeners and subscribers.
Paul, it's great to see you again. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me. The media this week is full of rhetoric signalling that climate and nature policies are on the back foot. Money rules, even if it's probably going to kill us. It seems to be so dominant. How does the Climate and Nature Bill work to protect us ordinary people and the environment?
Oh, well, great to be with you again, Nick. The Climate and Nature Bill is a fantastic bill which puts into national law our international commitments. We've made all of these commitments on an international stage for reducing emissions, for protecting nature. And actually, when you look within the national law, there's these huge gaps. So, for example, our current carbon budgets are not enough to meet our international commitments. So the bill, in the first place, puts those international targets into national law. And that's really important because governments come and go, but they can be held to the standards of the law and held to basically what we've said we'll do, walking the talk. The second area of the bill takes into account the emissions and ecological damage overseas. Because a country like the UK, with a lot of services, with a lot of the manufacturing sector that's declined through the years, actually has outsourced quite a lot of its emissions to other countries around the world. And we have to take that into account too, that and the ecological damage. Then in the third part of the bill, it ensures a just transition for people who lose out in this transition. So it helps for training, it helps for also investing in deprived areas as a priority. And so that's keeping everybody on board through the transition. And then the final section of the bill, it sets up a Climate and Nature Assembly. So we had this wonderful climate assembly quite a few years ago, but this would actually also include nature, and it would also be part of the joint strategy that would address both climate and nature together.
Okay, yeah. And that last point of addressing climate and nature together, how does this integrated approach, because we tend to think of them as sort of compartmentalized. You have a COP for biodiversity, for example. You have another summit for climate, and you have one for land use. How have you managed to roll it into this integrated bill?
Well, the bill sets up a requirement to do that by the Secretary of State. So that would then take the Climate Change Committee and the JNCC, which is the Nature Committee, and then it would allow them to be integrated together so that when you're making decisions on the one hand, it's not affecting the other hand. So a really good example of things like biofuels and bioenergy carbon capture and storage. These potential solutions, quote unquote, would have large scale biodiversity impacts. And so if we're relying on growing trees, burning them, burying the carbon, that's going to have widespread biodiversity impacts because of the scale at which you need to do that in order to draw down sufficient emissions. And that's a decision about mitigating today or removing emissions down the road. And I know several of you guests have talked about this in the past. What the bill does is it places that emphasis on near-term reductions in emissions rather than kicking the can down the road. And in terms of joining the biodiversity and climate pieces together, it will prevent those sorts of decisions being made such that, the future natural environment will be damaged even further.
Another thing I've heard of in the sort of national narrative, if you like, is this idea that well, all of this is going to be very expensive for people. When you were talking at the beginning, you said there are sort of provisions for making sure everyone's included in the transition. How can you guarantee people that they're not going to be footing the bill for it?
That's an interesting. So on the overall picture, we can't afford not to do it. About a third of the recent food price inflation has been driven by climate change alone. If we look at the flooding across the country, this is a vicious cycle of nature being degraded, unable to cope with the climate impacts getting worse, nature getting worse, and it's costing huge amounts of money, regardless of the values of nature itself. It's really affecting us. And our estimates of how bad this is going to hit us has been out over the years. It's been worse than we expected. So just to give you an example, in the UK case, the risk of these very high impact events, this flooding of over £1 billion a year, in the third UK climate change risk assessment is much higher than the previous assessments for the same level of warming. Another example, and I think this is really stark. I mean, when I first saw this, I was stunned. The third UK climate change risk assessment in 2021, they suggested that the chance of breaching 40 degrees by 2040 was 0.02%. And of course, we breached it in rural and urban areas the year later. And so these are huge economic effects in the very short term. And so we can't afford not to. On the point about helping people in a just transition, that is to be decided by the Climate and Nature Assembly and also by the Secretary of State. So that will then be rolled out by those. Now, because this is a private member bill, they typically don't have financial commitments associated with them. So this would have to be decided in the future if the bill gets passed.
When you talk about the Climate and Nature Assembly, and at the moment trust is low in politics, when you created an assembly, you're kind of expanding democracy, is how I see it. I mean, I'm trying to get your view on that.
I'm really excited by assemblies. I think they're a really effective way of getting around some of these polarized debates. They've been very, very effective in Ireland. The UK Climate Change Assembly was quite astonishing, the one that was held already. There was over 100 people drawn from all sectors of society, which is the same that it would be for the Climate and Nature Bill. And they were in conversation with experts over several weeks. And they came out with suggestions like banning SUVs, like frequent flyer levies, like reductions in meat. This is far beyond where the politicians are at. And actually, this is kind of understandable because when you look at the social science, what it's showing us is that we each underestimate one another's commitment for environmental change. And this is a systemic thing across society. And I think partly because we're pummeled by negative information all the time. So we think, oh, loads of people probably feel this way. Or it's the loud group that are actually made up of very small numbers of people that are shifting the way in which we perceive the public. So we're far too cynical of our neighbours. And the Climate Assembly really gets to the ground truth of that. So the Climate Assembly doesn't go far enough, but it goes much farther than the politicians. And a Climate and Nature Assembly would also then be broadening this democratic scope.
Creates a bigger platform for engagement with pretty much ordinary people, but at the same time promotes trust in what's actually coming out of the system.
Exactly. People get to collaborate on the future direction of Britain rather than a lot of the decisions being made in private, essentially, and also with the influence of large-scale vested interests.
You've worked very hard supporting this bill. You've been very vocal. How can ordinary people make a real difference right now in ensuring the Climate and Nature Bill becomes law?
Seeing this from the inside, as it were, you really can't underestimate a good email to your constituency MP. It is really quite surprising how much of an impact that has on the MP's perception of support out there. And I think this goes into the heart of what we were talking about earlier, where we underestimate our neighbours and we think people don't care as much as they do. And often it's because people do care, but they just don't get in touch with their MPs. And then so it's not reflected in national policy and law, and things don't change for the better. And then we get upset and cynical. So the main thing in which you can do is go and visit the Climate and Nature Bill website, which will tell you who your constituency MP is, if you don't already know them, and send an email with your support for the bill. And even if you've done that previously, sending another email saying, I would like to know the status of this, is really important too. So keep up the pressure.
So we'll put the link to that in the notes. So thank you very much. It's been really good to speak to you, and I really hope this is successful.
Great to speak to you, Nick.
If you are concerned about the future, then why not travel with me through every COP conference from COP21 in Paris to COP28 in Dubai by ordering my book, COP Out: How Governments Have Failed the People on Climate. In COP Out, you'll gain insights into what is actually going on in these supposed world-saving conferences and how we have ended up in this dire era of dangerous consequences. You can order COP Out via the link in the notes or on any online bookstore worldwide in paperback or audio version.